track of if anyone else tries to join. Okay, so this is the part 2 introduction webinar. Because we've had to go virtual this year, we've broken up the day and a half of training over 5 to 6 1-hour webinars. So the first one was kind of like basic vocabulary, government 101 type stuff that'll be useful as a general science policy training. And then for this introductory part, we're gonna go over the visit itself. So I kind of did a similar webinar back in the spring when we thought we were gonna be having these in person. The information is a lot the same, but there's a few key differences because we've switched to virtual and it's a significantly different time of year. So all the appropriations stuff that we would have focused on if we had done this in the spring, that's not really going to be as much of a priority now because it's the fall and it's really late in the fiscal year cycle. And for everyone tuning in, I'm Kelsey Crafton. I'm the John M. Bacall Public Policy Fellow for the AAS. So we're going to go over the basics of what a Hill visit is, which I think many of you have heard that before. We're going to go over more specifically what are some effective strategies for communicating with policymakers about science policy. And as part of going through what a Hill visit is, we're also going to talk about what you do after your visit, the follow-up, and then we're going to give you all a chance to practice your spiel after we've gone over how that spiel might be different because it's virtual this time. And then I'll briefly touch on logistics, which is going to be way shorter than if we had to deal with travel and everything for an in-person CVD. And then there will be a little bit of time at the end for questions. Okay, so setting up your meeting is the first step. All of you should have 2 senators and 1 representative that you need to contact. So that's 3 meetings you're going to need to schedule per person. You're not in groups anymore because you're not coming in person. So it's fine to just directly contact your representatives. It would be a little strange actually to have you do this in groups since it's virtual. It would be strange for the staffers and your representatives to have people on a virtual call when they're not their constituents. So that's why we're breaking you up solo. But Joel and I will be available to sit in on your calls with you if that'll make you more comfortable. And if there's a bunch of calls scheduled for the same time, since we do still have over 10 CVDers who will be scheduling calls all at the same day, give or take a day, we'll also ask some other volunteer leaders to help us sit in on your meetings, but I won't know how many extra people we'll need until you actually scheduled your meetings. So we do want you to schedule your own meetings because it helps you establish a relationship with the office that you're contacting. The idea behind Congressional Visits Day is not that it's a one-time thing, but that we're helping you through the first time of doing this so that you'll be confident to do it again on your own. If you have trouble getting a response when you reach out to the offices, I'd say if you haven't heard from them in 2 days, definitely email them again and also let me know. Or if you're having trouble finding the right people to contact, I can help you with that too. So staffers / the offices are generally pretty quick on email, but they do get a lot of emails. So that's why I'm saying 2 days, especially right now when they're not dealing with a lot of in-person visits. Earlier in the year, we said we had you start contacting them sooner and we had a longer lag time before you tap them again. This time that's not really necessary. And you can also ping them again sooner. So I'd say 2 days. And if they're snappy on getting back to you, if they're quick about it, you should try to be quick in replying to them. Also, staffers generally work 9 to 5 Monday through Friday. So if you send an email during that time, you're more likely to get an immediate response. Whereas if you send it over the weekends or overnight, it might get lost in the amount of emails they get. So even though ideally you would meet with your actual representative or senators, it's very likely that you'll end up meeting with a staffer instead, and that's totally normal. It would be really lucky if your representative showed up to the meeting, and that would be great. So you should definitely like prepare like they could be there, so you have some idea of what they look like and what their interests are. You should be able to find their contact information on their website. So if you just Google your representative and senators, they all have personal web pages, and it should have information on how to contact them. We were pretty close to actual CVD in the spring, so it's likely that you've already contacted everyone you were supposed to contact, so hopefully that's easier this time. There hasn't been any significant turnover since then, so it should be all the same people to contact. Yeah, question.
So for at least my senators, there was a web form that you filled out, and then I eventually got a response from a real person. So now I have that real person's email. Should I start by emailing them then, rather than beginning from?
Yeah. Now, if you already have someone's contact information, definitely contact them directly. You could even, if you had an email chain with them going, you could even reply to that old email chain so that they have the context of that you've already spoken to them. Yeah, so I would say the web form is going to be the slowest, and given that we've left less of a buffer, if you can avoid the web form, that's better. So it's better to call or email because it's faster. So I provided you all with this template message for the first time you tried reaching out in the spring. The template remains pretty much the same, except all after this presentation. Since you're just gonna see a recording of this and not the actual slides, I'm gonna copy and paste this text into an email and tweak it so that it's for a virtual meeting rather than for an in-person meeting. But the text is almost identical. And then if you get contacted by the scheduler, here's some examples of the type of text you might see. But again, you've all probably already contacted people from the spring. So they should say yes. It is very infrequent that they would say no. So when they say yes, you're gonna need to schedule a time. These meetings should not take more than 30 minutes. I'd expect them to be more like 15 minutes or less, especially because you're not there in person. So there's a lot of like body language stuff that's getting cut out and walking to and from the office and all that. So these are going to be pretty quick. And I would say prepare for it to like feel a little awkward because it's virtual, but everyone's on the same page. We all know what's happening and why we have to have these virtual, and that it's not the norm. If you can't meet with them at the time that they suggest, definitely suggest other times, like don't be skipping classes or important meetings to go to these. That's why we gave you a window of 3 days. Ideally, it would be good to have them all concentrated on the 16th, but if that's not going to work for you, anywhere in the 15th through 17th is fine. Members are mostly in session Tuesday through Thursday, so you'd have a better chance of seeing your member on the call if you schedule it in that 3-day window. That's why we picked that. If they say no, ask them if there's a point of contact for the district office, and also notify me that they said no, and we'll talk about how to schedule contacting the district office. But there's really no reason, given that all of this is virtual, for them to say no. We're still using a spreadsheet to keep track of all the meetings because Joel and I are going to need to sit in on everything, but rather than being put in groups, you're just entering your own meeting information. So it's a bit more simple because rather than 9 meetings per group, it's just 3 meetings per person. And you're going to enter the same text that you would have entered in the spring. The difference is this time you're also going to have a Zoom link for your call. I'd rather you just send that to me directly through Slack or email, because if we put all those Zoom links in the spreadsheet, there's a chance that when you go to click on a cell, it'll direct you to the Zoom link, and that's kind of a hassle, so we'll avoid that. So you do need to do some preparation before your meeting. If you're struggling with looking up this information, let me know and I can help you. So some important things to look into, which will be on all of these people's Wikipedia pages, it should be readily accessible, are what committees are your representatives on? That's a big one. And if you don't know what committees might be relevant to you, you can contact me again and I'll go through the list with you and say, oh, this relates back to astronomy and astrophysics or planetary or helio, or this agency that you might be funded by. You should also look into, just like on their web pages, it'll list the issues that they care about the most. It's possible that you have a personal story that doesn't necessarily have to do with your research, but ties into that issue, and it would just give you a connection with your representative. So it's good to just be able to draw on those things. And there will be later chances to practice after you've had time to look this stuff up before CVD. So today, we're going to do some practicing just based on the information in today's presentation, but you'll get other chances to practice after you've had more time to look into all this. Also, a good thing to look at is recent news/press releases out of their office. They should have a web page that lists the stuff that they want you to see. So that's a good place to look. There's also additional websites that you can go to if you want more information. So govtrack.us is a good place to get heaps of information about different members. But if you've just spent some time digging around their personal website, that should be enough. You're not going to retain everything when you go to the meeting. So. Okay, so that's kind of the basics of the meeting, and now we're going to go into how do you be more effective when you're communicating with them. So I'm going to circulate also as part of my follow-up email to this webinar, this document about evidence-based science communication with policymakers that came out of was done by the AAAS. So the AAAS is the American Association for the Advancement of Science. They're the largest scientific association in the world, and they produce heaps of content like this, and they lead a lot of science policy efforts. So this is a great resource to look at. I have here a list of things you might possibly be wanting to get out of the meeting. So I recommend looking back through this list after today and thinking about before the next time we practice, just before CVD, if you would consider asking for any of these things after you've had a chance to hear about what the current issues are and then look at their webpage and see what their interests are. Go through and see if you can have like a serious ask. It's totally fine to show up to this type of meeting as a constituent and not necessarily have an ask, but just have it be a get to know you meeting and offer yourself as a resource. But it's also good to have an ask. So this was also in the first presentation, but the 3 things that motivate a member of Congress are the media. So those press releases you're going to look at are pretty important. Their personal convictions / the issues they care about. Again, you can find that on their webpage. and their district, which their district/state will always come first, but it's possible that there's a neighboring district or state that is benefiting their district or state. So an example is there's a representative from Florida where there isn't a NASA center in his district, but the district right next to his has a facility that produces materials for NASA, and they employ a lot of the people who live in his district. So in that sense, he loves NASA because they indirectly provide a huge number of jobs to his district. So now I'm going to go through a few more of the meeting mechanics and message tips. So general rules for when you're advocating for science, you definitely don't want any part of this to be negative. You don't want to advocate for cutting other science or projects. You only want to advocate for getting money for your science or projects. We're not throwing anyone under the bus ever, because that'll end up backfiring on us. You don't want to bring up anything partisan. Even if you're meeting with a Democrat and you want to talk about Democratic stuff, just avoid it. Same way with Republicans. Like, even if you think you're talking about something that their party is for, it's better to just avoid obvious blatant partisanship at all. And be very careful to not come off as entitled to what you're asking for. You should be very humble and thankful, especially if they've voted to progress any legislation that might have benefited you. You definitely want to take a second to thank them for that specifically. Definitely do your research ahead of time. That's what the second bullet means. And also, even if you've heard, oh, this person I'm meeting with is anti-science because 3 years ago there was an article about them that said they didn't believe in climate change, you need to wipe that from your mind, because especially if it had to do with climate change, a lot of attitudes have changed. And just because they're anti-one science doesn't mean they're anti your science. So just go in with a positive attitude and try to not think about all the things you might disagree with this person on, especially since their staff don't necessarily hold the same opinions as them, and it's very likely you'll be meeting with their staff. So keep it positive. So a good approach to this, if you're struggling to think about what you're going to talk about, is to present yourself as an example of the science that's being done in the state or district. Especially if you work at an academic institution or a research institution, tell them where you work. Give that place a shout out so that they're aware that that place exists in their district. If it's an academic institution or a research institution, they're probably already aware, but it's good to remind them that this place is benefiting their district or state. Also tell them about how federal support has benefited you directly. Maybe it's not you who received the grant, but your advisor or someone in your department, and it's created a large group in your department, or you work at a federal facility. Just it's good to find a way to tie it back to federal support, but try to keep it all about your local situation. So just going in and saying, thank you for funding science in general, that's not super useful to anyone. So the core message is sustained support of basic research is driven by the scientific community. So you are there representing the scientific community, and you're showing that the funding that the government is providing for basic research is being used, and that it needs to keep getting funded. So during the meeting, if there's an issue where the person you're meeting with shows up late, just hang on for I'd say up to 15 minutes. I should be there, or Joel will be there, so you won't be alone waiting for them. But sometimes they have meetings that run over. I think I've waited as much as like 40 minutes for a staffer, and then they just had to reschedule. So it happens. It should be less so now, but you never know. You have to be on time, but they might be late. It looks good if you are taking notes. That goes both ways. So if they're taking notes while you're talking, that's a really good sign, but don't get offended if they're not taking notes. And in the same sense, it'll show them that you're valuing what they're telling you if you're taking notes. Make sure to introduce yourself. So don't skip that part. Don't launch into your spiel without saying who you are and why you're there. Also, if they ask you a question you don't know the answer, don't try to make something up. That's really bad, because they might end up quoting you and then it looks like they're lying or they're misinformed. So definitely just say if you don't know, but tell them you'll follow up, because you're definitely going to follow up and thank them for the meeting. So you should write down anything like that happens and then put it in your follow-up email. Also treat this like a conversation, not like what's happening now where I'm just talking at you all. There should be more of a back and forth, try to relax a little bit. And it's also important that you don't, in the same sense that you shouldn't be lecturing, like don't talk for too long, because normally they would be really tightly booked with meetings and you're not sure if that's still the case. So in your emails, it should say something about this meeting not taking more than 30 minutes so that they know what to expect when they go to schedule you. And you should make sure that you stay under 30 minutes. I don't think that's going to be a problem. I'm pretty sure most of these are going to be 15 minutes tops, but just in case. So if we're walking through how the meeting would go, everyone would introduce themselves. In most cases, it'll be just you. So you're going to introduce yourself in about a sentence or two. And it's your job to lead the meeting. You're the one that asked for the meeting. So don't pause and wait for them to initiate the conversation. You definitely want to thank them as soon as you can if the office has ever supported anything that's impacted you directly. And then get to what you're there to talk to them about, which normally would have been appropriations asks, but because we are not really doing that this time, you'll just have that in a document that you attach to the email you send afterwards. You can go ahead and tell them your story. And also try to think of some questions that you can ask them. Even if you already looked up the office's priorities, you could finish your story and then ask them, like, what are your space priorities or science priorities? Like, you probably already know the answer, but it's good to ask questions like that. Like I said before, it's a good sign if the staffer's writing something down, but if they don't seem engaged like that, don't worry, especially since it's virtual. It's going to be kind of awkward, I'm not going to lie. Also, be really careful not to say anything about campaigns or elections, especially right now. And also don't say anything about donations. But I don't think the donations part will be a problem. Right, so I've been kind of hinting at how virtual is different. I'm going to go over some of the topics that you might bring up specifically during your meetings. So normally, if it was springtime, appropriations would be kind of the central ask of your meeting. You might still want to talk about that, so I'm just going to give you the latest numbers in case that's something you want to pull on. So for NASA, well, first of all of these numbers are, when I say the latest numbers, so the House has released their appropriations bills, but the Senate has not released theirs. And then after the Senate releases theirs, they have to go to conference. So the numbers will change again before they get signed into law. So these are very preliminary, but this is where we're at right now. So for NASA, the House recommended pretty much flat funding for science, which is not keeping up with inflation. So usually a 0% increase is actually a small cut. So that's not great. And then heliophysics has a double digit decrease in its budget, which is really bad. So if you work in heliophysics, you might want to bring that up, especially since you're a constituent. It's okay to talk about these things. NSF got a very small increase. That's almost keeping up with inflation, but I'll point out later, there have been a lot of proposals in Congress lately to dramatically increase the NSF's budget. So this is not along those lines. The Department of Energy's Office of Science and NIST have both been kept pretty much flat. NIST in the president's budget was going to get some pretty bad cuts, so it's good that they've been kept relatively flat, but not great. So this also relates to heliophysics. If you work in space weather at all, there has been legislation introduced in the House and Senate in the last year or so to direct the nation to work on space weather forecasting and invest in it, and set up like a plan of action. So it's already passed the Senate as of this summer, and now it just needs to make it through the House without any changes, which could actually happen this month, but it's like a 1% chance. But it would still be great if that happened and it got signed into law. That would be a miracle. So if you work in that field, it's definitely worth bringing up that piece of legislation. If you're meeting with your representative, if you're meeting with your senator, they already did their part. So another big issue that you could talk about is COVID relief, obviously. So there's this RISE Act that was introduced in the House this summer that would authorize $26 billion in relief funding specifically for federal science agencies to support researchers that have been affected by the pandemic. And it's particularly focused on the impacts to early career grant recipients. So if you're early career and you're on a grant, it's worth mentioning. It's kind of just worth mentioning in general because you almost certainly know someone who's would benefit from this legislation getting passed. But if you can't think of anyone off the top of your head, you don't need to mention it if it would be too much of a stretch. So likely this RISE Act would get folded into some kind of larger aid package, but if you've been watching the news at all, you would know that those talks have almost completely stalled out, which is very unfortunate, which also spells bad news for them passing a budget before the end of the month, that they're kind of not able to agree on anything financial at the moment. So just urging them to pass a COVID relief package in general could be something that you bring up, preferably one that includes help for researchers. So a couple other issues I already mentioned, the proposed dramatic increase to NSF's budget. If you are a recipient of NSF funding, shoot me an email and I can send you some specific legislation to cite. There are multiple reauthorizations in progress right now, but none of them are going to get passed this year. They would all get passed next year at the earliest, but there is NASA, NSF, and DOE Office of Science are all being reauthorized right now. And if you don't know what that means Congress is currently writing up the law that directs them to continue functioning. And in doing so, they specify what the agency should be working on. And that gets into a little bit of how they should spend their money, but really the appropriations process is what actually gives them the money to spend. So speaking of appropriations, if they don't pass, which they're almost definitely not going to, if they don't pass a budget by the end of this month, we're either going to enter a continuing resolution, which means flat funding, nothing gets reassigned. We just continue at current year levels, which is not great because it doesn't keep up with inflation, but it's significantly better than a government shutdown. So we definitely want to avoid a government shutdown because, as some of you might have noticed, a couple years ago when the government shut down, anyone who was a federal employee had to go without pay and without being able to access their research. So, and if you are a recipient of federal funding, you should definitely talk about that. So some things to start to think about for your practice this time and for later. You want a jargon-free explanation of your work. Whether you're going to ask for anything or not, you should still talk about what you do because you're the constituent doing research in their district. So that is, the fact that you exist and are doing that is relevant. You want a summary of your background. So you don't want to just be this like random scientist who does this like cool random science. Try and humanize yourself a little bit. And you should have the answers prepared to the questions. Why is your work important to you? And why is your work important to other people? So definitely think about that. It doesn't necessarily need to be perfect in any sense, but you should have thought about these things in advance when you're going into your meetings. And then after the visit, you are going to need to send a follow-up email that thanks them for meeting with you. If they asked any questions, you want to answer those questions. Even if you already answered the question in the meeting, it's good to type out the answer because maybe they wrote it down and lost the paper. I don't know, something. Definitely write down the answers to any questions that were asked and offer yourself as a resource because this is how you establish your longer lasting relationship with the office. So I'm going to send you all a template for that follow-up email. So we're going to do some practice of what you might say during the visit. So some things to keep in mind if you're struggling to think of what you might talk about. There's, like I said earlier, there's been a pretty big shift in attitude towards climate change, which has effects on the rest of science in Congress recently. So if you read a news article that's more than like 2 years old about a representative or senator and their feelings towards climate change, it's probably not true anymore. Everyone's on board about climate change being a problem. The conversation now is just, what are we going to do about it? And so that kind of reflects the attitudes towards science, is that in general, Congress supports science, they believe scientists, but that doesn't mean that they will question why to fund your specific science. But know that the attitude is generally favorable and you can work with that. There's a lot of interest in space because of commercial and military prospects. So if you find that your staffer is mostly asking you questions about those kinds of things rather than scientific research, that's why. And just try to do your best to hold up your end of the conversation if they do that. And the current Congress really likes STEM education. So if you're a TA, if you do any kind of work with children in STEM ed, those are all great things to bring up, even if they don't necessarily relate directly back to your research. It'll establish you as a good resource on that type of topic and make you more memorable. Okay, so I'm gonna leave this slide up while we're practicing because these were some of the most important points, which was not being negative, keeping it positive, and doing some research ahead of time, which you can't really do the research part right now, but you can practice keeping it positive. So we're gonna do the breakout session now. Does anyone have any questions before we start that? Okay. I can pause the recording if you would feel awkward practicing while it's still going. Yeah, okay. Oh wait, that was pause.